everyone. My name is Jodine Baker, and I am the Vice President of Research, Advocacy, and External Relations at Imagine Canada. It is my pleasure to extend a very warm welcome to everyone here. We're really happy to have you all join us for this deep dive into how nonprofits can effectively advocate during elections. Before we get into the conversation, we'd like to begin by taking a moment to acknowledge the physical lands that we're joining in from today, even during a virtual event. Imagine Canada's staff, operations, work, and network depend on traditional Indigenous territories to provide us physical space, sustenance, safety, and community to work, live, and play. Our physical head office is located on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wyandot. We acknowledge that these lands are covered by Treaty 13 and the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge that these lands are still home to many diverse First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people. Personally, I am joining you today from Winnipeg, which is located in Treaty 1 territory, the home and traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and in the national homeland of the Red River Métis. We acknowledge that our ability to live and work on these lands today is a direct benefit of policies of expulsion and assimilation of Indigenous peoples during the time of settlement and confederation and since. The harms of these policies are many and are still being felt in Indigenous communities today. We express gratitude towards the Indigenous peoples who have and will continue to steward these lands. We commit to amplifying the voices of Indigenous peoples and working against the everyday forces of white supremacy and colonialism present in the nonprofit sector. Our team is actively engaging in training and education related to reconciliation and decolonization. We aim to listen, learn, establish meaningful relationships with our Indigenous sector colleagues, engage in courageous conversations, and take actions that advance reconciliation in the nonprofit sector. As we're all joining in remotely today, I'd like for us to just take a short moment to reflect on the lands on which each of us are situated, the land that each of us is living on, working on, the land that's allowing us to join in as this virtual community today. Thank you. Today, our wonderful moderator, Prairie Chiu, will facilitate a conversation between our two speakers, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. Just a little housekeeping note, we are going to ask that you use the official Q&A function in order to participate. You'll see it at the bottom of your screen. It's one of the buttons you can push. We won't be taking questions from the chat. We find we often lose them in some of the comments that people are welcome to share during the conversation. But if you do have questions that you would like one of our speakers to answer, please do use that Q&A function at the bottom of the Zoom screen. You can submit the questions at any time. They'll be answered, though, towards the end of the session. This meeting is being recorded, and you will receive the recording within a few weeks, along with related resources. Closed captioning is enabled, and if you have further accessibility questions, please let us know in the chat. Before we dive in, we'd like to thank the Tiny Foundation, the McConnell Foundation, Mastercard Foundation, and the Counselling Foundation of Canada for their support of this work. So now I would like to hand it over to our moderator, Prairie Chiu, Director of Engagement and Advocacy at Vantage Point, who will introduce herself and then get the conversation going. Prairie?
Thank you so much, Jodine. Hi, everyone. Welcome. First, thanks to Imagine Canada for inviting me to moderate this timely and important webinar. As Jodine mentioned, I'm the Director of Engagement and Advocacy at Vantage Point in British Columbia. Our organization, Vantage Point, promotes connected communities by nurturing a strong nonprofit sector. And we do this through delivering training, resources, and advocacy that builds connection, creativity, and impact in the sector. Vantage Point is also the convener of the BC Nonprofit Network, which aims to address provincial issues impacting our nonprofits. In BC, we have an important partner in our Parliamentary Secretary of Community Development and Nonprofits, and we're working closely with Imagine Canada and other similar networks across Canada to advocate on behalf of our sector. We want to take a moment this morning, this afternoon for some of you, to acknowledge the current tariff situation that we find ourselves in and its impact on all of Canada, including our nonprofit sector. While today's webinar will not focus on this issue, we recognize its significance and we encourage anyone who would like to share their thoughts, insights, or feedback on how these tariffs may affect the sector to please reach out to Imagine Canada via the email address being shared in the chat right now. Great. Though we don't have the exact date yet, we know that there will be a federal elections on or before October 20th of this year. The purpose of this webinar is to build the sector's understanding of the opportunities elections present to advance policy priorities, as well as the strategies and tactics that can be used for election advocacy. Of course, federal elections are far from the only major political events that are impacting Canadians and the nonprofit sector right now. Developments in the US that are in addition to the tariffs, we're all paying attention, but they won't be the focus of today's event. If you're wondering about the rules that nonprofits and charities must follow when engaging in elections, we invite you to watch the recording of Imagine Canada's last election readiness webinar, which is also being shared in the chat now. So without further ado, like to move on to our wonderful panelists here. Today, we're being joined by Tim Gray, Executive Director at Environmental Defense, and Mary Bridger, Head of Policy and Advocacy at CARE Canada. I would want to invite you both to tell us a little bit about the work you do and the experience that you have engaging in advocacy and policy work during elections. Maybe I'll start with you, Mary.
Sure. Thanks, Prairie, and thanks for convening this space and certainly creating a dialogue opportunity for folks to share what's going on in the news today and how it's affecting our organizations. I'm sure I'm making the assumption that a lot of our participants today are coming from civil society, but I'm sure there are others, so it'll be interesting to hear the perspectives that come out on that. Prairie already mentioned I am the Head of Policy and Advocacy at CARE Canada. And I'm joining today from just outside of Toronto, gratefully living within the territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island. My background is really I've been a civil society advocate for my entire career, really focused on gender equality for the most part, and international development and programming, working previously with the UN as well as with other civil society organizations globally. Since joining CARE, CARE itself has decades and decades of experience with election engagement, and I'm really excited to be bringing my skills to that this year. CARE has been around since 1945, so we've seen a few administrations in various countries, including here in Canada, where we've been an active advocate and partner with governments since, I believe, the early 60s. So it's a long reputation, and certainly we started with delivering care packages kind of in a humanitarian context, and we remain a humanitarian and kind of gender nexus focused organization. And while we, of course, are bipartisan in our approaches, we've certainly ridden the wave of different governments and how we've engaged with them and building relationships. So happy to share a little bit today of what we've done in the past, what we're looking forward to doing with this particular moment. And if at any point during this webinar you hear me mention the word unprecedented, just mute me automatically, because I think we've all had enough of that word right now, despite it remaining true.
Thank you so much, Mary. We won't do that. We all need to keep using that word, unfortunately. Tim, over to you.
Thanks, Prairie. Yeah, and thanks for hosting this today. I think it's very timely. If you listen to some of the folks in the political world, they're saying we may have a federal election called as soon as next weekend. So it's very, very timely to have this webinar today. I do work for Environmental Defense. I'm the executive director. I've been here for about 11 years. Environmental Defense is a environmental policy focused charity. We operate across Canada. We've been around for just a little over 40 years. We had our big 40th anniversary gala last winter. We work on climate change, which is our largest program, toxic chemicals, plastics, land use and city building in the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and fresh water across Canada. We have offices here in Toronto, Ottawa, and in Alberta. We have about 300,000 supporters across the country, and we specialize in having those 300,000 people be in conversation with their elected officials around environmental protection. So elections really matter to us. And for us, there are three main things that we do during that period. We spend time in advance working with the political parties around platform development, and that takes a long time. In fact, it never really stops. But of course, it's more intense in the few months in the lead up to an election, either provincially or federally. Then there's the work that we do actually during the writ period. And as we've grown, we've become much more active in the actual advertising space and being out there and trying to make sure our issues are front and center of people's decision-making around who and how they're going to vote. And then there's service provision to our supporters, providing them with comparators between what the parties are promising that they're going to do on issues of concern to people who care about the environment in Canada, helping them figure out how to vote, how to connect with other people in their community, and having a deeper dive into the policy space around environmental issues during that election period. We've been doing that with an increasing resource base over the last 10 years. And as I think the entire sector has become more professionalized around election engagement, so too have we, I think.
Thank you so much, Tim. I think you're diving right into how our attendees can start getting engaged right now. So I want to start us off on these questions. Thinking about our attendees, can we kind of share with them, and I'll pose the question to both of you, why they should consider engaging in advocacy this federal election and what opportunities this election presents? Maybe I'll start with you again, Mary.
Sure, I'll jump into the hot seat again. I think for us, kind of when we approach at Care Canada, when we're approaching kind of an election or we think it's on the horizon, I mean, really this moment starts, like we start having this conversation pretty far in advance, assuming these are not snap elections. We obviously don't know exact dates, but we've known for a while that there was going to be an election at some point this year. So this conversation starts pretty early on. The main objectives for us as we go in are really threefold. We're looking at trying to influence policy. We're trying to make sure that the policy issues that are at the heart of our work and that matter to us and kind of the agenda is kind of reflecting those key priorities. So that one of influencing policy is one objective. The second one is that it's a real opportunity for us to raise awareness on the issues that matter, as well as mobilize support and mobilize our supporters around issues that matter to them. Often our supporters are looking for ways to engage and are looking for us to provide direction in terms of ways they can get involved, what issues can they be raising, how can they support in meaningful ways. So that second issue of raising awareness and mobilizing supporters is one that we look to. And then the third one is around relationship building as a whole. So regardless of what's going to happen in an election, we need to make sure that our relationships are strong with government stakeholders as a whole. So really elections provide an impetus moment for us to check in on those relationships, for us to lean on them, for us to build them where they might not be the strongest. So kind of those are the three objectives that we have going into any election. In this particular election, there are unique challenges, perhaps unique opportunities as well emerging that are shaping how we lean into or perhaps away from different objectives in this moment. I think that we know that from a civil society perspective, this Canadian election sees stakes that are incredibly high. There is a global shift happening that we want to influence how Canada participates in or does not, that is moving away from ODA spending, that is really taking shifts away from gender equality support, that is really looking scary for climate progress around the world. So this is a really big moment where civil society is, I think we're all feeling a little bit nervous and we're all trying to find ways to channel kind of our concerns into being heard as an electorate, as kind of civil society representatives. Now, again, we are bipartisan, but it's not, I don't think I'm kind of being dramatic when I say that the politics are politicized right now. The narrative that we're living in, it is very contentious. There's a lot of issues that people care strongly about that are being really put out on the headlines in scary ways. And really what we're trying to do is remain focused on our core strategy, remain focused on our objectives, and really it's about not getting distracted and remaining focused on what we're trying to do that is aligned with our strategic plan. So there is huge opportunity in this election, in all elections, but it's really key to make sure that your tactics are focused and that your tactics are remaining kind of aligned.
Thank you, Mary. Wow. And so hard to remain focused when so much is coming at us and not react in a knee-jerk response, responsive way. Yeah. Tim, over to you. What are some opportunities that you see for this election?
Yes, so just elaborate a little bit on the things that, those three buckets that I described previously. So on the policy development side, we do a lot of work with a coalition of 15 major Canadian environmental organizations that do federal policy work. So we try and coordinate our platform work to have a conversation with the parties through that, at least at an introductory level. And that's always a bit of a kind of an opening gambit, like here's our binder, here's our policy binder, do you want to have a conversation? Because that's really the way that it occurs. And is there something in here that we can further dive into based on your interests, or where you think your emphasis is going to be as a party as you approach an election? That's like a normal part of the conversation. In this circumstance, of course, a lot of that has been thrown up into the air a bit. I mean, there's core elements of what we've been advocating for that will persist from the fall into, this about to be held federal election. But clearly, the apple cart has been upset a little bit. So we will be diving a lot more into the attributes of our work that link with the reconfiguration of Canadian relationships to other democratic countries, whether that be in the Asia Pacific or in particular in the European Union, and looking at the mechanisms that they have in place around trade rules related to plastics and toxics and climate, and think about how Canada needs to survive economically with new partners in a world where our former major partner in this continent, had kind of similar policy priorities around addressing the climate crisis, controlling pollution, a lot of those things. They're clearly pivoting away to looking to create themselves as an island of fossil fuel development and anti-climate policy, et cetera. So what does that mean for Canada, especially in a world where we're going to have a hostile trade relationship? So thinking through of all that and putting that into our propositions to political parties is top of mind. In fact, we're working on a memo that we hope to finish by the end of today that'll be fed into the federal government. So that's really top of mind for us. And then we will be retooling a lot of our public communications as we go into the election cycle to acknowledge the time that we're in, and to acknowledge just the fundamental fight for freedom and independence that Canadians are facing, and just to not pretend that's not happening. Like we're gonna acknowledge it and talk about the place that the protection of Canadian environment fits within that. And we'll offer resources again to people within that changed circumstance and try to explain to them the policy priorities that have been chosen by us, and that we hope any government that they might elect might choose as well.
Thank you, Tim. I think what I'm taking away from your answer is really needing to be adapting and adjusting as the landscape shifts, which is a nice segue into my next question, which is essentially a little bit of a deeper dive into that, because I think as the landscape shifts, we have so many different issues that we could advocate around. What kind of policy issues catch the attention of candidates and parties during elections, and how do organizations pick, and how do we pick which policy priorities to focus on during these periods? Because we if we have limited resources and capacity, we may not be able to advocate around them all. Maybe I'll start again with you, Mary.
Sure. I mean, this is the conversation that I don't think CARE is alone in having right now about kind of identifying policy priorities that are going to be a core part of our election strategy. It's something that we start our election strategy with trying to establish. And I think this ties into the conversation we were having just a minute ago about not wanting to get distracted and not wanting to sway too far based on where the narrative of the day is blowing you. I think every organization on this call is going to have their own different set of pet issues and priorities and kind of core purpose to them. And I genuinely think that while there's a need to balance being adaptive with kind of maintaining your true identity, there's such a risk with constantly swaying. It's really, really important that you are building your election strategy as a tool for your overall strategic plan. It is not a standalone document, we always say. It is something that exists to support our strategic priorities and our strategic plan. I think that it's hard though, because civil society as a whole, we are often purpose-driven. Our supporters come and find us and engage with us because they see their priorities reflected in our values and our work, and that's what's bringing them to be our supporters. So you really do have a lot to risk with being too kind of wishy-washy in your priorities, depending on what the government of the moment is wanting to focus on. That's a really easier said than done. And while CARE can say that with the perspective of having been around since the 1940s, it's hard. You have the long-term perspective and the short-term risks and opportunities, and it's hard to find that balance. That being said, I mean, I spoke earlier about the need to really be nonpartisan and the kind of positioning we have always taken to partner with different governments. It does include being adaptive and resilient. As much as I'm saying you need to stick to your strategic priorities and not verge from them, that doesn't mean that you don't change anything at all, and that you don't change your messaging, and that you don't change your tactics. I think there is the need to be adaptive, and we're finding that balance right now. I mean, we need to really know what the parties are talking about. So the first and foremost is you've got to have done your research on the different parties and what their priorities are. That goes beyond what their kind of immediate speeches are saying. It looks at the trends. It looks at what is in the policy platforms. It looks at what some of their voting trends have been. A great way to do that is to be in collaboration with your peers, because we can't hear all of the things all of the time. So share intel with peers, understand what the parties are talking about, understand what friends at an aligned organization heard in a meeting. Like, share that information, don't gatekeep it, because we all benefit. I think that right now in this particular election, as we look at what our policy priorities are, kind of, I can speak from the perspective of CARE Canada, where we know, especially today with tariffs, economic priorities are going to be the absolute focus for a huge part of the party platforms. We're going to see domestic economy take a huge priority. Does that mean that we're not going to have conversations with our government stakeholders about kind of women's economic empowerment globally? Does it mean that we're not going to be raising kind of the banner of humanitarian response and the need to kind of work on peace building initiatives globally? Absolutely not. But it does mean that we are going to be prepared to go into every conversation with the right arguments for those programs. We're going to be talking about the return on investment for overseas aid. We're going to make sure that it's understood that there are economic benefits to this expenditure. We're going to talk about kind of how investing in kind of peace building and resilience and kind of humanitarian response ultimately leads to global stability, which has economic benefits. So we're going to be making the case for why our programs tie into their priorities. It's not about us shifting our priorities, it's us messaging differently. So while CARE is going to still be talking about all of these things, you might hear us talking more about women and girls rather than using the feminist agenda. You might hear us kind of speaking more about green energy transitions, which I think Tim will talk about a lot more, instead of using climate change in every meeting that we have. We are going to be adaptive with our words while remaining true to our program and our identity. to some degree, kind of the way I'm going into this in every meeting as well, I have preferred words that I'd rather be using. It's the work that matters more than the words. So we're being adaptive, but maintaining that true focus on the work itself shouldn't ultimately change.
Thank you for that, Mary. Tim, maybe I'll turn to you around sort of tactics and strategy a little bit more. I think that was something that Mary brought up. During an election, organizations can choose to go more public, doing things like media or public events, or they can take a behind-the-scenes strategy approach, speaking directly to candidates and party leadership about their priorities. Or maybe they're kind of doing a combination of both these approaches. How do you make that choice? What would your advice be around that? And what does in your experience, what are the benefits and drawbacks of these different strategies and approaches?
Yeah, I mean, I think so much of whether or not your issue is going to be front and center in an election is going to be based on the work that you've been doing between the elections, of course. We just went through an election cycle here, and a number of our key issues were front and center and even in the leadership debate, which, for us is a reward in itself, and that these issues are salient and being talked about. So, you have to think long-term in terms of your impact on electoral outcomes, and not just one election cycle. But in terms of the choice between those tactics, we're just always monitoring where the world is going and which ones are most effective. I would say that platform development work and ongoing conversation with the folks that are crafting them and constantly changing them with the times is always a great place to be, because it's relationship based. I mean, if you have a good relationship with the writing team around platforms in all the major political parties, either you or your partners, and they at the last minute, and this has happened to me a few times, like literally the day before the platform is going to go to press, they might be like, damn, we really need something in this space. And they'll literally be calling you up the night before it's going to go to press and looking for something. But that doesn't happen if you don't have that relationship that you've developed over a period of time, and they know that if they need something in that particular area, that you're the person they need to go and talk to. So that's really helpful and necessary. I think a lot of the work that we used to do around organizing riding level conversations between candidates, a lot of that kind of in-person work that people used to rely on to help, the public would rely on to help form their opinion about who they're going to vote for. A lot of that has been shut down. Here in Ontario in particular, we just went through an election where there was a ban by the Progressive Conservatives on having their candidates even show up at all candidates' meetings, and they were largely prohibited from speaking to the media except through Central Campaign Office. So the ability to do that in-person work has really been hampered, and the Progressive Conservatives started doing that, and because they continue to get reelected, they obviously are not being punished for that behavior, right? So that's become institutionalized, and you just have to recognize that trying to have your voice heard in a place where that conversation has been shut down by the people in power is kind of smashing your head against the wall in a way. So we've moved a lot of that conversation with our supporters to being mediated by the media itself, or direct conversations as we grow our supporter list, being able to reach a couple 100,000 people here in Ontario with our message directly, for example, is the way that we get out a lot of our material, or through media interventions rather than doing that in-person stuff that we might have done 10 years ago. So again, our strategy remains the same. Like, we're trying to advance progress in a particular, say climate change, for example. But how we might do that, the tactics will vary, of course, over time, but also between parties and the language that they're willing to use. We'll sit down with any party and say, okay, well, you don't like carbon taxes, so you think pricing pollution is a bad idea. Okay, well, what's your alternative? Well, we don't actually think we should reduce emissions. And we'll get up and say, well, that's nice to talk to you, but we clearly have nothing to talk about, because anything that any government that is saying that they don't believe in climate change, is one we're not going to be having a productive conversation with. So we're not going to waste our time or yours. So that's, it's being consistent on your strategy, but we're more than willing to talk about the 1,000 different ways you could actually tweak the economy or regulations or personal behavior, corporate behavior, to actually create that transition, but we're not willing to have a conversation about not doing it because it's just so much of a threat to humanity. So we won't back away from the core strategic focus, but we will be flexible on tactics.
Thank you for that, Tim. Yeah, I think folks are definitely wondering about the tactics, and I think you give a good insight there into how you've shifted in Ontario, and we might likely see our entire sector need to shift with a change in federal government if there's some different sort of ways of engaging as well. Okay, so my next question is I want to pose to both of you. I think we've been talking about this a little bit, but want to maybe elaborate a little bit more or add on to it. Elections, of course, are short here in Canada, and engaging in advocacy during these periods can take a lot of energy and resources and capacity. How do you make sure that any activities that you're doing serve your cause in the long term and not just during the election period? Tim, I think we've been hearing from you about how you're kind of engaging year round. So if there's anything you want to add to that, or even how organizations can sustain that level of activity, through that election cycle, it's a lot of work. So yeah, maybe I'll start with you, Mary, and then I'll shift over to Tim.
Sure. I think that to some degree, this goes back to the point that we were talking about before, where it's about, is your election strategy and are your election tactics aligned and serving your ultimate strategic priorities? Because as long as you are advocating for things that remain true even outside of an election cycle, and as long as you are raising the flag for your strategic priorities overall, then it's never going to be time wasted. It's never going to be something that doesn't have a return on that time investment that you're putting into it. I think especially when you look back to those 3 key objectives that I was saying that at least form our election strategy around kind of influencing policy, that may not always pan out. So kind of figure out what policies you're really going to throw your effort behind and make sure that they are 100% aligned to what you're trying to do. The raising awareness and mobilizing your supporters, that's always going to pay off. You're always going to see value from mobilizing your supporters and kind of engaging with them in ways that are meaningful to them. And then the third one around relationship building, again, that's something that regardless of the outcome of an election, I would say going into an election, your election strategy should include government engagement across different kind of parties. That's really, really important. None of us know the outcome of any election. I think the last kind of 4 months in polls here in Canada should be a testament to we don't know what's going to happen. So we should really be investing in that relationship building with stakeholders kind of across parties. And again, after an election, that will pay off for you. You will still be able to see benefits from those strengthened relationships. So I think that would be my main advice, is make sure that the efforts that you are engaging in with the election are aligned and are ultimately going to be sustained in terms of their impact post-election, regardless of the outcome. I mean, from a tactics perspective, I think that's something that when I sat down, I think probably in July of last year, to write a Care Canada election strategy, I wrote that document on one screen, and on the other screen was our post-election government relations strategy. Those two go hand in hand. Your scenario planning and what you're going to do after this election need to be 100% aligned, because you don't want this to be wasted effort. You want to make sure that you have a follow-on plan regardless of the outcome. So that's just kind of from a tactics perspective as we approach our strategy, is making sure that you're already thinking about what's going to happen day one after the election and how you're going to continue this narrative through, so that it's a cohesive effort.
Thanks, Mary. Tim?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that Mary has said. Maybe just add a little bit of color and detail around some of the work that we've done. When we were thinking about what kind of election advertising we were going to do in Ontario, and we're in the process of doing this now for the federal election, we looked at some of the major policy related issues that were most salient to our supporter base over the last year. And then we developed some election-focused messages. And then we did a significant amount of message testing with our supporters, A/B testing on social media, et cetera, to try and figure out which ones were going to have the biggest reach. And then, of course, chose the ones that were before we started spending a lot of money on them. But again, you don't want to invest in something where a particular outcome in the election cycle like either makes or breaks your issue, right? Like you want to be able to build off the momentum that you create during that election cycle to be able to use that in government relations or furthering your supporter growth or influencing the policy direction that issue is going to go on in the longer term after an election, regardless of who wins. And that's both good use of resources, but it's also consistent with the legal obligations that you have as a charity, to be nonpartisan, right? So, there's always you have to be careful around. This goes back to your previous webinar, but you need to be consistent, both from a charity's perspective, but also elections perspective of having a track record of having worked on that issue, especially if you're going to spend a lot of money during the election cycle as a third-party advertiser, like we do. So you don't want to be caught out as saying, oh, well, you never talked about that issue before, and then you suddenly spend $100,000 on radio ads. Why was that, right? So we always are choosing among the things that we have a deep track record of pursuing, partly because it gives us momentum going forward, but also builds on the recognition the public already has of that issue, and also meets the requirements around electoral spending that exists in both of those pieces of legislation.
Appreciate that enhancement there of your answers. Thank you. I'm gonna move us into some audience questions right now. We have just a little bit under 20 minutes to ask some questions. So we've already got a couple in the question and answer box. So if you have additional questions that you'd like to pose to Mary and Tim, please put your question there. There are two immediately that jump out at me as probably on top of mind for all of us, these tariffs. The first question here is how much opportunity will there be for candidates to address issues that are not specific to the current issues, such as tariffs, U.S. relations, for small not-for-profits now? How much attention do you realistically think we will get? And I think this related question is that given that the tariffs are coming into effect today, if we're working on an issue that's not directly related, any thoughts on the timing of when to send a letter out regarding our issue? And don't want to sound tone deaf. Are either of you interested in answering that? Mary?
Sure, I can jump in. I worry about this Q&A section of the webinar because there's so many questions that we are trying to find the answer to as well. I would not in any way want to say that I have all of the answers, but all I can do is share how we're thinking about similar questions and kind of where we're leaning. I think the tariff question and the attention thing, we had a little chat before the webinar started around the impact of the tariffs, and that was the exact concern that I raised, that it's already always a struggle to get your government stakeholders to really invest in the areas that are important to you and get their attention. This is going to make it harder, not kind of sugarcoating anything. It is going to be harder to get attention on kind of issues. I mean, the issue I'm trying to get focused on is ODA and the investment in ODA and the value add and whatnot. The one thing that I can say, which we were talking about before, is you need to align what you're asking with what their priorities are. So again, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to have an answer to how to improve the economy in kind of Ontario, for example, but it does mean that if you're going into a meeting and if you manage to secure a meeting and you get somebody's attention, you better be prepared to understand how the economic impacts relate to what your ask is. So I am not going to be having any meetings right now where I don't speak to the return on investment for overseas dollars. because I need to be making sure that my requests are responsive to the economic realities right now. And they can't immediately shut down by saying, well, we're too concerned with the economy. All right, here's my kind of immediate follow-up. It is that this is good for the economy for XYZ reasons. This is ultimately what I'm asking for is an ultimate benefit that is aligned with your interests. And you need to really build that bridge between what their priorities are with the economic interests, as well as what your priorities are, whether it's social infrastructure investment, overseas dollars, whatever. You need to really physically build that bridge for them, and then kind of use your strong relationship building skills to walk them over the bridge to help build that alignment. So I think for us, kind of, as I mentioned, the practical element of that is that we will be making the case that ODA has a return on investment. There's evidence to support that. We're going to be making the case that peace building and kind of humanitarian response overseas ultimately brings about stability, which is an economic benefit globally. We'll be talking about the value add of investing in kind of women and girls. We'll be making that case, but we will 100% only be making that case based on the economic arguments for it. We'll be leaning away really from the moral arguments for it, because we just don't think there's an audience for that in that moment. That feels like it would be tone deaf, to quote one of the comments that I think came through. We need to be making the economic case. So we'll be pivoting, not pivoting our priorities, but pivoting our messaging to align with this moment.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, we have a question from Emily McDonald. For an organization that is just starting their advocacy efforts, who should they be connecting with on campaign teams? Any advice for making that first introduction?
Campaign teams as in party platform teams? Is that the question?
Emily doesn't stipulate, but I'm imagining yes.
Okay, well, I'll make that assumption just for answering the question. But yeah, I mean, I think it's good to connect with if you're working with a new organization that has others in the sector, like reaching out to companion organizations that may have deeper experience around government relations and platform development. You may be able to insert some of the policy priorities that you have within a larger coalition ask, if such a thing exists in your sector. That also, it's more likely that the people that have been doing this work longer will actually have the names and email addresses and phone numbers of the people within the respective parties that you actually need to have a conversation with. That's always probably the fastest way to do it, I would think. If you really don't have either one of those, you don't have those people in your Rolodex, or you don't have people in your sector is you, then probably one of the places to start might be with a local MP or MPP, and get them to identify who that is leading on that platform development for that party in the province or federally. But starting with people that have experience within your sector is probably the fastest way to have your voice inserted into platform development, I would say.
Can I build on Tim's answer there, just
Absolutely.
to kind of reinforce? I think one of the key things that I don't think can be overstated is how effective collaboration in terms of advocacy can be. And I mean, I've looked through the participant list, and I can find at least half a dozen collaborators that I normally work with in terms of familiar names, that it's actually fairly rare that Care Canada is going to go about kind of an election tactic completely alone. More often than not, we are going to be having at least a half a dozen conversations with peers to either share intel, to develop shared tactics, to develop shared messaging, to create shared kind of external products, to create shared letters that we're sending out with both of our names on the bottom. We work in collaboration actually far more than we work in isolation, and that's absolutely deliberate. That is something that we are doing because it helps cut through the noise. You are using double the information in terms of who you should be targeting. We all have different contacts, so my contacts might not be the right for the certain ask that we want to make. So maybe one of my peer organizations has that right contact. I think that really that collaborative space is so important, especially during an election where that attention, especially during this election, where we are saying the attention will be very hard to get. I think that's one aspect of kind of how you reach the right people is by not trying to do it alone and relying on shared contacts. I think the other aspect to that is no contact is a bad contact to some degree. One of the election tactics that we're running with right now here at Care Canada is we are actually equipping our board members and kind of our staff members with the right talking points and kind of what are the issues that matter. And they're asking us for this. It's not that we're forcing this on them, but if anybody wanted to, if they are engaging in their all candidate meetings, in their own ridings, let's make sure that they feel equipped to be advocates for the causes that we're trying to advocate on. Making sure that anybody can reach their kind of elected or candidate in their riding with these issue areas is really important, because I've been in meetings with federal MPs who are saying, you know, nobody ever asks me about foreign aid. This isn't a big deal. I want to change that narrative. I want people in the candidate meetings to be asking these questions. And the best way I can do that is use my existing supporter base and equip them with those messages so that we can start making this a priority. So no contact is a bad contact is a real kind of baseline, but also rely on shared contacts and rely on shared intel.
Thank you, Mary. And such an important reminder for our smaller organizations that, that we need to collaborate with each other. I think the next two questions I want to ask from the audience are sort of somewhat related to that. From Anonymous, in an election year, what is the average increase in your communications budget to further your strategic objectives in an effective way? Anyone have, either of you have insights on what that increase might look like? Tim?
I'm not sure what the percentage would be, but you're limited by the expenditure limit at the level of the election, right? So Ontario, it's about $126,000, I think, is the maximum that you can spend. So that would be a pretty small portion of our overall communication budget for the year. I don't know, maybe 5% or something, right? But it doesn't matter what percentage it is because it's an absolute amount. So for many organizations, you would probably never have to worry about, getting close to that during election cycle, because if you're smaller, you're not going to spend that kind of money. For us, we do have to pay pretty close attention because we do, we're spending all the time, but as soon as it's during the election period, it's election spending. So if you're a registered third party, then everything that you're doing is part of that. So in fact, you end up, for larger organizations, you can actually be dialing back your expenditure during that election period.
Thanks, Tim. My next question is from Samantha. For small nonprofits with limited resources, how can we learn more about how to construct an economic argument and show the economic value of what we do? Often organizations don't have numbers or data on this. And I know here in BC, we're definitely, trying to think about how we can support our sector in terms of getting those economic impact numbers, which they know that they need to bring to every meeting, like you mentioned, Mary, but hard to get our hands on. Any insights into how we might do that?
I wonder if there's an opportunity, certainly kind of, I don't have documents to hand that I've referenced before and I've put into briefing notes and whatnot. I don't have them to hand right now, but I'd be happy to kind of, if there's a follow-up of sharing additional resources in the follow-up to this webinar, I'm more than happy to share some of our common tools and kind of references that we use with Imagine Canada, and we can circulate some of that, because I will caveat that the research that's been done on the return on investment of overseas dollars is limited here in Canada. There are global arguments that I think can be applied to the Canadian context. So I'm happy to share some of the global resources that we rely on kind of as Care Confederation to make that case.
That would be wonderful. I'm sure our attendees would love that. Tim, any thoughts from you around that?
Yeah, I mean, it can be challenging for sure. I mean, we do some original research. We'll contract, professional consultants to undertake things, but quite often we'll do that with partners, where we have a shared objective. We just recently did a deeper dive into some of the overall economic benefits to Canada by having federal government start to pay for operational funding in the transit space, for example. And we did that with transit riders in Vancouver and Toronto, and then we took the lead on designing the project and then contracted that out to a third-party consultant who has the economic chops to do that. So working with others is a good way if you have something specific that you can't find. A lot of the time, we're relying on work that's been done by other organizations in our space, and pointing to the economic returns shown from a particular policy approach, from the work that they've done. But even that, of course, requires to have staff or volunteers that are very knowledgeable in that policy space and able to identify that kind of work. But those are the two most common. Obviously, you need to have some money to do the first example that I provided. The second one you can do with no money, but you have to have someone to a salary or a volunteer who's going through the literature and finding examples from other areas or in your policy space to provide that economic rationale.
Thanks, Tim. Our next question is from Joanne. Joanne's question is, I was a federal election candidate in 2015, and my experience was one of very tight message control. We received emails every day with the issue of the day that we were encouraged to focus on at events and public forums, and also received key messages and speaking points, and strongly encouraged not to elaborate further. I'm interested in the panelists' perspectives on would you recommend taking a more macro approach instead of trying to engage individual candidates directly? Any thoughts from either of you on that?
Well, I think it's just a firsthand example of what I was talking about in terms of message control in the previous election here, as led by the incumbent government, where candidates were not allowed to go to all candidates meetings, and no commentary was even allowed by candidates to the media. I think it's bad for democracy. I think it really doesn't give the public a good flavor of who they're voting for. But clearly, central party control feels that it makes them more likely to win elections, and so they've instituted it. But at a personal level, I think it's a bad development, in the same way that propaganda on social media controlled by a billionaire is a bad idea. It's clamping down and eliminating and silencing a diversity of voices that are needed in a civil society to function well.
Okay, we have one question from Melanie who is asking, any tips for finding the who's who in platform and mandate development as an organization that doesn't have any internal government relations, many internal government relations? I think we've touched on this a little bit, but anything to add for Melanie?
I think that's the same thing of make sure you're talking to your friends in the sector, because you may not have all of the intel, but somebody else might, and you might know things that they don't know. So don't undersell what you do have to offer to coalitions and collaborative working. But also, I think this is something where if you are holding the intel, share it around, because raising the arguments that we're all going to be raising with these stakeholders is only going to benefit. So if you're holding information about who the stakeholders are, share it. If you don't have the information, reach out and work with your peers, because somebody out there knows. I think when it comes to and if they don't know, then it's often because this isn't public kind of knowledge. Like it's really, really hard, and it changes. Even kind of those who have really, really deep government relations, even those who have kind of hired government relations firms to guide them, it's still a bit of a guessing game right now in terms of who is shaping policy sometimes. If you are not in kind of the current majority government, then, or in this case, the minority government, then you don't necessarily have to kind of be very overt with who is shaping the policy. Like, we don't know right now really clearly with absolute certainty who is in Poilievre, for example's inner circle. We have some names that we think are likely going to be very important that we're trying to build the relationships with, but we don't know. This isn't public. So use the intel you're getting from your peers. But again, remember that no contact is a bad contact. Building relationships is always a bit of a guessing game. And even if you don't reach kind of the inner circle, if you will, you're still going to find somebody who can later become a bridge builder for you. So reach out, don't be shy reaching out, even if you don't know exactly if they're the right person.
For that advice. We're just rounding up to the last couple of minutes of our webinar. I had actually a question for either of you. What types of advocacy activities would you advise nonprofits and charities to maybe shy away from or stay away from that might be high risk during elections? Are there any that we should absolutely not explore?
I'm happy to give kind of, this kind of ties into the other question that Tim answered really well, but happy to provide our perspective as well. There was a question about what increase to your comms budget do you see during election cycles? And really, we don't. We don't necessarily prioritize our external communications as a real tactic during elections. It's for a variety of reasons. I think we've mentioned before, and there was another fantastic Imagine Canada webinar on the need to really play within the rules, and kind of external engagement is something that makes people nervous and whatnot. We tend to not prioritize it for a variety of reasons. Part of it is we don't always register as a third party, so there is that caution. Part of it is that we don't often know if it's going to be a great return on the investment, because it is a very noisy time. It is a very difficult space. And who are you trying to reach in that public messaging, in that communications? Is it that you're trying to reach the government stakeholders and the decision makers? Is it that you're trying to influence your supporters? Kind of, you really need to refine your messaging depending on who you're trying to reach. And doing kind of big comms campaigns, at least for us, hasn't always been the most effective use of our money. We would much rather focus on, again, a sector-wide joint letter on shared issues that then gets sent to targeted people across different parties, things like that, which ultimately, other than the time we spend, doesn't have a huge cost implication, but can still be impactful. So my caution would be seeing if they're making sure that the dollars you're putting towards any election engagement are actually going to deliver a return for you based on who you're trying to target.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate it. Yeah.
That is, the obvious is, don't do things that are partisan if you're a charity, because you're getting in trouble for that. But also, I think, if you're going to engage, especially in an advertising space, or, whether that's, traditional media, radio, print, or on social media, don't be tone deaf to what the dominant kind of theme of the election is, right? So, for example, we've been working on opposing a mega highway that the provincial government is trying to push through north of Toronto here. And so our radio ads were all changed during this election cycle to focus on the risk to food security and farming that would occur from destroying thousands of acres of farm in relevance, in relation to the tariffs that were announced yesterday, right? The impending tariffs. So if the whole election is about tariffs coming, you don't want to be not talking about that in the issue that you're bringing forward. So, don't be completely offside with where the entire public attention is on your issue, or else you'll just be forgotten and missed.
Thank you so much, Tim. And thank you, Mary, both. I'm going to turn things over to Jodine to wrap us up. Thank you for such a wonderful discussion.
Yes, just to echo that, thank you again to our expert guest speakers, Tim and Mary, and to our wonderful moderator, Prairie, for joining us today. We really do appreciate you sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. I found that a fascinating and incredibly timely and helpful discussion. Thanks to everyone who joined us today in the audience. It's really great to see so many folks interested in advocacy and public policy. A recording will be shared by email within a few weeks. Finally, just a reminder, if you would like to share any insights or thoughts on the impact of the U.S. tariffs on Canada's nonprofit sector, please do email us. You will find the email address in the chat. Thank you again, everyone, and wishing you all a great end to your day.